Chess YouTube, do you want to see Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT, utterly torture Hans Niemann in a game of chess? Because that is what he does right here, starting with the move 1a3. This entire game, from start to finish, is just pure peak Magnus Carlsen, utterly torturing Hans Niemann with the most bizarre, unusual, and strange ideas you will ever see in a chess game. I mean, Hans here, his brain has been melted in this game. It is just so glorious to watch. All right, in the game, Magnus here, opening 1a3, the most disrespectful opening you can basically think of. And Hans goes d5. Then we have d4, knight f6, knight f3. So far, so good. Sort of a 1d4 style opening with the move a3 inserted. And Hans here has literally like 5 or 6 or 7 good ideas. You can bring out the bishop to f5 or g4. You can play e6, the queen's gambit decline move. You can play the Slav move, c6. You can play the reverse queen's gambit with c5. There are so many options here, but in the game, Hans plays very solid, and he does go bishop f5, the reversed London opening. Now, if we swap the boards, it's sort of like black here is playing like some kind of London in reversed, but it turns out in this position, white actually has some pressure starting with the move c4. It almost doesn't make sense to me, but this move in response to bishop f5 is actually very, very strong. And here's the problem. If black were to say, I don't know, defend with e6, that makes the most sense to me. The problem with that is queen to b3. Like e6, queen b3, and suddenly b7's under attack, d5's being pressured, and it's not that easy for black to defend. And black has a hard time in like all of these lines. If black takes the pawn, white goes e3 and gets a pretty good version of a queen's gambit decline as the bishop in the queen's gambit accepted, as the bishop in that variation here, it belongs back on c8 where it can go to b7 later if a6, b5. So Magnus has famoosed Hans Niemann into this weird line where it's actually not that obvious how to defend. Hans in the game, c6 is the move, the Slav defense move. We have a Slav defense pawn structure here on the board, but again, Magnus just piling on the pressure, knight c3, and now what can black do? Hans Niemann, I mean, he could take on c4 playing sort of a classical Slav, but he's really not a classical Slav player. Instead, in the game, e6, heading for the famous pawn triangle formation. We have the pawn triangle here, famous in the London, the Caro-Kann, the semi-Slav, and many other openings. But Magnus here, this guy knows exactly how to punish this from black, and he plays the move knight to h4. And now look at this, the bishop on f5. I mean, yes, it's outside the pawn chain. Yes, that is very good. But the problem with this, the bishop, it's about to be lost to the knight. And Magnus here, he's going to win the bishop pair if he wants it, and have two very strong bishops on c1 and f1, which he can use to torture Hans through the rest of this game. Magnus, how does he always manage to open with something like 1a3 and then somehow get these torturous positions where he can just slowly grind out his opponents? I don't know how he always does it. It really is a mystery to me. I mean, comment down below if you think you know why Magnus always seems to find a way to play the most absurd moves and somehow make it work every single game. Comment down below. I'd love to know why you think that's the case. All right, black here. Obviously, you don't want to leave the bishop on f5. That would not be a good idea. White could take it and just obliterate black's pawn structure. That's not a good idea. So black here should probably go to either e4 or g4 or g6. In the game, bishop to g4 was chosen, one of the better ideas. And now Magnus. I mean, this guy, Magnus is good enough to know that the best idea here for white is going to be h3. You drive back the bishop. Then you go g4, drive it back again, and then you take on g6. It's a very common idea in certain lines of the Slav opening. Very, very thematic, very common. But Magnus here, he does not play h3. Oh no, instead, he plays a move that, I mean, when you see Magnus play this move in this position, there's only one explanation, and that is the move f3. There's only one explanation for this move right here, and Magnus is literally just playing with his food. He's playing with Hans Niemann. He's just insulting his intelligence. He's like, you know what? I'm going to play the most absurd moves possible and still beat you in the game. 1a3, 7f3, setting up the bongcloud move, maybe king to f2. Magnus just does what he wants in this game. All right, Hans, bishop h5. Magnus here, he trades on d5, c takes. Okay, now, Magnus, what is your plan? Are you going to go g4 or something else? Magnus here plays the move g3. Okay, why would Magnus go g3? If you thought the idea was bishop g2, you clearly have not studied Magnus Carlsen's games very much, because that is not the idea at all here. Instead, it is something completely different, and you're about to find out what that is. All right, Hans, knight c6. So far, Hans playing a very solid game of chess by all means. He's a little better as black. He's got the very solid pawn structure, 2 good knights, the decent bishop. I mean, Hans here playing very classical chess so far. All right, Magnus, knight g2. What on earth are we watching? Knight to g2. Magnus going knight f3, to h4, to g2, fianchettoing the knight in the fastest way possible. All right, Hans, he's not amused. Queen b6, pressuring b2. The idea being now, if bishop g5, you lose the b pawn. So Hans, again, playing very solid. Now, Magnus e3, blocking in his own pieces even more, defending d4 a little bit. Now Hans, bishop d6, a solid move. And now Magnus, knight to f4. Magnus going knight f3, to h4, to g2, and then all the way to f4, finding a 4-move path instead of the 2-move path to the f4 square. And this move is not very good. Hans Niemann can take the knight if he wants to. That would be the strongest move here. But instead, Hans, he's a little flustered, and he simply retreats. Bishop g6. So Magnus kind of getting in the head of Hans here, kind of forcing out some slightly weaker ideas, and we're seeing that Magnus, again, so far in this game, is just kind of psychologically running circles around Hans so far. It's really, really amazing how this always seems to happen. All right, Magnus here. Knight takes, h takes, standard stuff. And now, what does Magnus do right here? I mean, comment down below. Like, take your best guess. You're Magnus Carlsen. You're the greatest player of all time. You're playing Hans Niemann in the 2022 FTX Crypto Cup, by the way. And, of course, even back then, even all the way back then, Magnus had no respect for Hans. So, what would you do right here as the GOAT, as someone who has no respect for Hans in general, as a person, a chess player, on and on and on? Well, Magnus here, king to f2, the bongcloud move. Who does this guy think he is? Magnus Carlsen. Magnus here. I mean, this is not the end of the king's journey. Let's just say that. Here, Hans, a6, guarding b5, and now king to g2. This was the real idea behind g2. It was not just the fianchetto the knight. Oh no, it's a fianchetto the king on the g2 square. Magnus, what have you become in this game? All right, Hans, he's got a lot of options here, a lot of solid ideas, like rook c8, like to, queen c7, like castles. In the game, he does castle. Short castles is the move. And again, so far, Hans, by all means, is doing fine. He's got a very solid classical setup. His pieces are very, very good. A good pawn structure. Like, everything is good about his game. But Magnus, what is he doing here? The king, the pawns blocking in his bishops. I mean, somehow he's doing okay, but I struggle to understand how Magnus, other than perhaps he has those two Bs, the F1 and C1 bishops. Other than that, I fail to see how he's actually still equal in this game so far, according to Stockfish. All right, Magnus here. Again, you're the greatest player of all time, facing Hans. What do you do here on move 16? I mean, how do you increase the pressure? Do you go, I don't know, bishop to d3 or queen to c2, or find some way to develop, or b4? Oh no. Oh no. If you thought that, you are so far off the mark, it's absurd. Magnus here, g4 is the move, threatening g5. Why? Because why not? You're the GOAT. You can do whatever you want. Hans, he knows the best way to meet a flank attack is an attack in the center of the board, and he finds the strongest response immediately, e5. Hans playing like a GM in this game, playing some very solid chess, counterattacking in the center, trying to expose the weakness of this move g4. But Magnus is not done. Oh no, g5. He is just going for it. He's pushing the pawn one step further, ignoring the attack on d4. Hans here, he takes on d4, counterattacks on the knight on c3, ignoring the attack on his knight on f6 right here. And Magnus, he takes back, and then we have knight to h5. Now, at first glance, this knight may look dim, but it turns out Despite being on the rim, oh no, it is not dim at all. It covers a lot of key squares, including f4, g3, f6, and so on. And with the action kind of happening on the king side here, this knight is surprisingly decently placed. And it will always have access to f4 in the future if it needs it. All right, now here, of course, the pawn on d5 is hanging. That was kind of the entire idea behind g5, removing the defense of the d5 pawn. So g5 knocks away that knight. We have some trades. We have knight h5, and now he jumps in, knight takes d5. All right, here, Hans. The d4 pawn is hanging. You can take it. You can go back. Turns out going back is the slightly stronger idea, but instead Hans here, he decides, let's go for the endgame with the queen captures move. Queen takes d4. We have queen takes, knight takes, and suddenly we have an endgame where let's slow down and take inventory. Magnus here, he has those two Bs, the c1 and the f1 bishops. They are a massive asset in this game, but Hans has maybe the better pawn structure, maybe the better pieces, and maybe the better king. So overall, Hans here, according to the engine, is a little bit better. Again, the better pieces, better pawns, better king, and so on. But don't forget, Magnus has those two Bs, the c1 and f1 bishops. If he can get those bitches working in this game, if he can get them to say, I don't know, c4 and c3, really good squares. Actually, more like that. If he can get them there where they're active and slicing down the board in different directions, things could get very tough for Hans in a hurry. Let's see what happens. All right, first of all, rook b1. The rook getting out of the way of ideas like knight b3, for example. That would be very strong, trying to take away those two Bs from white. So, rook b1 played in the game. Rook fd8, a very solid move if I've ever seen one. Rook d8 develops the rook, pressures the knight on d5, and so on. Now Magnus, bishop d3, developing, and then rook a to c8. Now, these moves look logical to me. They look very, very natural, but somehow, some way, Hans already is starting to lose the thread of the position, and these two Bs are slowly going to take over in this game. Magnus, rook d1, he slides over, defends d3 and d5 indirectly, and also sort of pressures d4 indirectly, a very, very solid move. Now, black, knight d6, he retreats, pressures g5. Now, bishop e4, supports that knight. Okay, king to f8, and then bishop d2. The bishop may be going to, say, a5 or c3, some decent squares. Now, Hans, knight h to f4. The knight finally jumps back in the game. Of course, it is defended twice by that knight on e6, and the bishop, therefore, white cannot win a piece. It is supported. And of course, it does hit the king. Here, Magnus, he trades on f4 with his knight. Knight takes, and Magnus here, he still has those two Bs, and very importantly, as more and more pieces come off the board, these two bishops will get stronger and stronger. Now, knights are about as strong as bishops. However, when one side has two bishops and the other side is 1 or 0, the two bishops tend to be worth quite a lot, especially in an open endgame like this. All right, king to f1. The king slides back. b6, defending b7. But now, bishop b7 hits all the same. And look at this, the rook, it can't defend a6 as you would lose the rook. Magnus wins a pawn. All right, rook b8, bishop takes. He's officially up one pawn in the endgame, and his plan from here, of course, as you all know in the endgame, the number one rule is make a pass pawn and push the pass pawn down the board to promote. So, for example, moves like b4, a5, and so on could be coming next, a4, a5, to get that pass pawn on the queen side and then push it down the board to a8. All right, black, knight e6, retreats, pressuring g5. Bishop c4, attacks the knight. Knight d4, jumping in, pressuring f3. King g2, defends. Rook b c8, pressures the bishop. Sort of this back and forth cat and mouse waiting game. Bishop a6, hits the rook. Rook c7, bishop c3. The bishops starting to slowly do their magic in this game. Knight e6, a4, the pawn march begins, and we're seeing Magnus in this game, despite opening literally one a3 and playing some weird bongcloud style moves, he's slowly but surely just taking over in this game, and now the endgame here, having the extra pawn and those two Bs, is literal torture in this game. This is the last thing you ever want when you're facing Magnus, is be down a pawn and down the two bishops. That is just like not what you want. Now here, of course, The pawn on g5 is hanging. Question for you. Should Hans Niemann take this pawn right here? It turns out the answer is no. Here, Hans Niemann, he did his CCTOs, checks, captures, threats, optimizations. He knows if you take on g5, that is a bit of a mistake, as Magnus has the killer blow. Rook takes d6, giving up the rook with the idea of the skewer, and then maybe even rook d1 later, piling up pressure on the pin piece. So instead, here, Hans, king to e7 is the move, centralizing his king, supporting the bishop on d6, but Magnus h4 defends g5, and that one window of opportunity to win the g5 pawn is now officially gone in this game. All right, knight f4 jumps in with the knight, hits the king, king f2, knight e6 goes back, bishop b5, now rook h8, pressures h4, rook h1, defends h4, bishop c5, hits the king again, the cat and mouse waiting game, king g3, bishop d6, Tom and Jerry are just going back and forth, king g2, knight f4, king f2, bishop c5. Hans here, he may think he is the cat, but oh no, in this game, he is the mouse. King g3, knight e6, and then rook b to e1, and pinning that knight, and finally getting out of the way of these annoying knight jumps. Now, bishop d6 hits the king, king g2, and there are no more checks, as again, that knight is pinned to the king. Now, f6 targets g5, rook e4, a very strange move, potentially intending rook h to e1, doubling up rooks, or maybe even a rook lift on the fourth rank like this. f5 hits the rook, rook c4, the rook lift has been completed, attacking the rook, and Magnus here, he knows, as more and more pieces come off the board, the endgame just gets better and better and better. He knows if you were to wipe out every single piece, if you take away every single piece from this endgame besides the kings and the pawns, it's a completely winning pawn endgame. You just go b4, a5, push the pawn, and if the king chases it, then simply king to g3 to f4 to e5 to e6 to f7 and so on. You win the pawns and you win the game. Here, Hans, knight f4, hits the king, king to f2, bishop c5, more cat and mouse. But here, Magnus, he says, you know what? I've had enough of this Tom and Jerry cat and mouse game. Rook takes c5, dropping the hammer with the tactical idea. After rook takes, bishop to b4, pins the rook on c5 to the king on the e7 square, and therefore here, of course, basically winning the game. We have knight e6, bishop takes, knight takes, then b4, gaining space on the queen side, driving back this knight from c5. It is getting very close to the beginning of the end, as those pawns are simply cooking on the queen side. There is nothing slowing them down anytime soon. Knight e6, bishop c4, targets the weak knight on e6. Of course, there were stronger ideas, a5, but Magnus here, he's so far ahead, it just doesn't matter one bit. All right, bishop c4 is the move. Knight d4 jumps in. Rook to e1 hits the king on the e7 square. King d6, rook d1, pins the knight. King e5 defends, and now the key deflection idea, f4, deflecting the king away from the defense of the knight. And here, Hans, how can you defend? King e4 is the only move. If you take the pawn, you lose the knight with check. So, king e4 chosen in the game, but now bishop f1 retreats, and again, the pawn cannot be taken, as again, you lose the knight. So, king d5, a5, pass pawns, well, not a pass pawn yet, but soon to be pass pawn must be pushed. B takes, pass pawn must be pushed. Rook b8, a6, king c5, rook c1, hits the king, king d6, king e3, hits the knight, knight c6, and now rook c3. The rook lift on the third rank guarding the b3 square. Magnus here, I mean, he's got everything under control. The pawn is defended. The king is centralized. Sooner or later, you push this pawn, deflect the pieces, jump in, win these pawns on g7 and g6, and that will be all she wrote. Knight a7, Hans doing his best to blockade the pawn. Bishop c4, rook e8 hits the king, king to f3, rook e7, dropping back on the 7th rank, guarding g7 and a7. But Magnus here, rook e3 offers the trade. Rook d7, rook d3 forces the trade. The king moves. The rooks fly off the board. Bishop f7. The pawn cannot be defended. This is the beginning of the end. King c6. Bishop takes. King b6. The pawn is lost. but it's too little too late, because now h5, Magnus, he knows you must create the new pass pawn as soon as possible, and that pawn is simply unstoppable. Knight c6, h6, g takes, g takes, and in this position, there's no stopping the pawn. There's nothing Hans can do. For example, if knight e7, all you gotta do is simply take the pawn right here, and if knight takes, the pawn pushes, and that is all she wrote. And for that reason, right here in this position, Hans Niemann in the 2022 Miami FTX Crypto Cup, one of the first games these two players have ever played versus each other, Hans Niemann, after the opening 1a3, the most disrespectful, torturous idea Magnus has ever busted out versus Hans. Hans has to resign to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game between Magnus and Hans, again, in the 2022 Miami FTX Crypto Cup. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please smash that like button, comment down below. And by the way, at my free online chess community, drmikechess.com, you may have heard of it. Right now, we're doing 2 separate challenges, a 30-day October challenge and a 7-day Black Openings challenge. And we are giving away the most absurd prizes ever for free to the winners. In our 30-day challenge, we're giving away literally 1-year diamond membership to chess.com to 3 separate winners. And to 9 winners total, we're giving away things like private one-on-one lessons with me, a 2,000 ELO online player, free access to my future private paid coaching program, all kinds of good stuff. Did I mention 1-year diamond membership, chess.com, to 3 separate winners? By the way, also, we have a 7-day challenge happening right now where we're giving away other insane prizes. So it's free to join the community, the challenges, everything. And my students there are making insane progress. I literally have students gaining 100, 200, even 400 ELO. Yes, it's verified, 400 ELO in a single month. Personally, I've never heard of any other coach getting a student to gain over 400 ELO in 1 month. My student Umar went from literally 1,100 to over 1,500 in 30 days. I mean, I wish I could say someone else had these results, but I haven't seen it. So if you want results like that, if you want to join 2 insane epic challenges happening literally right now, if you want to win a free 1-year diamond membership to chess.com, drmikechess.com, links above there, down below in the description. It's all free to join, free to play, free to learn. So what more could I possibly promise you? I mean, I'm giving away everything I can right here. So again, drmikechess.com. I will see you there. And as always, I wish you the best of luck in your chess improvement journey in 2025 and beyond. And I'll see you in the next video.